We'll go ahead and get started. Looks so pretty in here today. Everything's decorated real nice. We're going to have a big party today. 7 graduates. Wow. No, that's just high school. Yep. Hey, Jacob, would you mind getting the doors back there? And we're going to have people coming and going quite a bit today, bringing food in and all that sort of stuff. So we'll just have to work through it. Yeah. Got this wonderful microphone. Okay, so here we are. This is Bible Basics class. Let's see if this is going to work. Davey, it's not working. Okay, there we go. So we're getting down pretty close to the end of the longest part of all the study is this part about the Bible. And we've looked at so many different things about it. And you go, man, I don't even remember what we talked about, much less remember what were said. But that's okay. This isn't for us to memorize all this stuff. It's for us to get an impression. And then we learn more about it as time goes on. But that's what we want to do, is leave that impression. Now, we're using this chart right now, the Bible timeline. And we tried using our laser pointer earlier, and it just the camera doesn't pick it up. That's why I use this. And now I can't get to it because we can't move the tables today. So I'll just have to reach over there. I'll put the shadow where I want it. That's pretty good. Okay, so we looked at the patriarchal dispensation pretty fully. We've been studying about the Mosaical dispensation. The law was given at Mount Sinai, and everything that's in these stories here. This is kind of fun doing it this way. You have to think, there's that shadow. All the way around to Christ's ministry here is all under the law of Moses. And one of the things we talked about last time was that Jesus lived and died under the law of Moses. Jesus was a prophet, a priest, a king. He was the anointed one. And as a prophet, he was an old covenant prophet. Jesus was the last of the old covenant prophets. And of course, he also was the Messiah. And so it was his death that ushered in the new covenant. But he lived and died under the old covenant. Paul called it a curse. He said you must keep it perfectly. If you're going to be justified by law, you must perfectly fulfill the law. There's law and there's grace. And this was a covenant of law, but it had a provision of sacrifices. It was a sacrificial system that when they sinned, then they offered sacrifices. They did it all the time. It constantly reminded them that they were sinners and that sin requires a price to be paid. That went on for 1,500 years. But the Hebrew writer says that the law was a shadow. It was physical things that they did which represented spiritual things that would be coming in the new covenant. And so they were ingrained in seeing these things, and then after a bit, when the spiritual covenant came in, they began to realize, and it was pointed out to them by the teachings of the apostles, how those things converted over to the new covenant. Now, here in 2 Corinthians 3, verses 4 through 11, it says that the law was a ministry of condemnation. He says that the law was fading away or had faded away. It included the 10 commandments. It said the law that was engraved on stones. And that law that was engraved on stones was called the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 4, verses 10 to 13. It specifically says that. It's called the ministry of death, as opposed to that which gives life in the new covenant. So, we looked at all this stuff last time. Just want you to kind of get this back in your mind. Colossians chapter 2, verse 14 said that the law was nailed to the cross. When Jesus died on the cross, the law died with him there. Ephesians 2, verses 14 and 15 says that he abolished the law in his death. It was causing a separation, and it made peace between Jews and Gentiles and between man and God. And so it was abolished. And we also pointed out that Jesus highly regarded the law. He said, I didn't come into this world to abolish the law or the prophets. He said, until all of it is fulfilled, not one period, not one comma should be taken away. You should obey the law, he told the people in his day, because they were Jews. They lived under the law of Moses. He said, until it is all fulfilled. But when it was fulfilled, then it was taken away. He fulfilled the law by living a sinless life. He fulfilled the prophets by fulfilling all the predictions that were made about him. And then John said that the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So we talked about all that stuff last time. Now, we also said this. Why was the law given if it was going to be replaced? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn over to Galatians. Galatians chapter 3. Galatians 3:19. He says, why the law then? Why did God give the law if he was going to take it away, if it was only intended to be temporary? He said it was added because of transgressions, having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator, until the seed should come. The law was given until the seed should come. And he says in verse 16 that the seed is Christ. The last thing he says in verse 16, that seed is Christ until Christ comes. And when Christ comes, then it will have fulfilled its purpose. Well, what was its purpose? Well, we had up there verse 23, before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore, the law has become our tutor, our schoolmaster, or let's see, somebody else had something else last time, our, what was it? Guardian, to lead us to Christ, that we may be justified by faith. So the law had to do with, here's regulations, you keep those regulations, you miss it, you're a sinner, got to offer all these sacrifices. But then the new one is a person lived perfectly. He lived a sinless life, and now he has made he is the sacrifice for our sins. And we put our faith in him, and we trust him, and he is now the sacrifice. We don't have to keep doing those sacrifices anymore. But it says in verse 23, before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to the faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. So faith has come. We're no longer under the law of Moses. And so, what does that mean to us? Well, we talked last time about animal sacrifices. You don't see any church that offers animal sacrifices. Everybody realizes that we have a sacrifice and we don't need to keep doing that. That was a huge part of their life and a huge part of the law. But it wasn't just that part of the law that was taken away, that was nailed to the cross. The whole thing, everything was. That means of justification by animal sacrifices was done away. But we also talked about these other things here. Passover, Sabbath, feast days. and stuff like that. Those things also were part of the law and are no longer part of the new covenant. Now let's go back over to Colossians. Colossians chapter 2. And you remember there in verse 14, it says that Christ canceled out the certificate of debt, a certificate that consisted of decrees. That word decree there is the Greek word dogma. The certificate that consisted of dogmas. The word dogma means law or ordinances. He canceled out the certificate consisting of decrees that were against us, that were hostile to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. So this is the context he's talking about when he comes to verse 16. Now note, this is very important here, verse 16. He said, therefore, since this is true, that all of these things of the law, the old covenant, is taken away, therefore let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink, or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. But the substance belongs to Christ. So now you realize that so many of these new converts had been under the law of Moses. They had observed these laws for all their life. And some of them were Gentiles who had never observed these laws. But they're all disciples of Jesus. They're all part of the church. And so he's saying to, I think specifically those who had not been under the law, he said, don't let anybody judge you on these things. They were nailed to the cross. He said that in verse 14. They were taken away. And so you don't have to do those things. Like there were lots of food laws in the law of Moses. Things that were clean, things that were unclean, things you could eat, not eat at certain times, stuff like that. But that doesn't matter anymore under the new covenant. There were drink laws. There were festivals. There were a number of festivals that happened all through the year, and the Jews observed those things. And even after the church was established, you find the Jews still observing those festivals. And in my mind, it's okay if it's part of your national heritage, if it is a part of your culture, your race, to do those things. But you don't have to do them, and they don't have the significance anymore that they did at one time. There was a new moon festival, and there was the Sabbath day. And so the Sabbath day had been important. Where do you first hear about the Sabbath? You go, let's see, Genesis chapter 2. Let's look over in Genesis 2 for a second. All right, Genesis 2, first 4 verses. The heavens and the earth were completed. Chapter 1 talks about creation. The heavens and the earth are completed, all their hosts. And by the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So, the seventh day was important because everything was completed. All creation was done in 6 days. God rested on the seventh. He kind of set a precedent here for mankind, which basically says don't work all the time. Work 6 days, get your work done, and rest some. If you don't ever get it off your mind, if you don't ever put your mind on other things, some spiritual things, or if you don't just rest your body, then it is just extremely wearisome. It'll just wear you out. But you don't hear anything more about this until you come to Exodus chapter 16. During the patriarchal dispensation, you don't hear about Sabbath. There's nothing in there. The word Sabbath isn't even found in Genesis 2. It just talks about, it's called the seventh day, but it's not the Sabbath until you come to Exodus chapter 16 and verse 23. Moses said, "This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord." And he goes on to instruct. They were receiving manna, and they were supposed to gather the manna for 6 days. They weren't supposed to gather it on the seventh day. The seventh day was a day of rest. And so that which had been done way back in the beginning with God's creation is now brought into the people of Israel under the law of Moses. It was a big part of the law of Moses. Well, from that time in Exodus 16 on, man, you hear Sabbath all the time. Many laws, many teachings about it. It's one of the 10 Commandments as well. So it was a old covenant thing that started off with a general thing that happened with God. I think it's still a good idea to rest sometimes, even for tax accountants. Sometimes you just have to rest a little bit. And that's what the Sabbath was about. So, what is our holy day today? Is there a holy day for us? Is it called the Sabbath? The word Sabbath, it means seventh day. That's what it means. But it sounds like, and the etymology of the word possibly had come from the word rest. Rest in Hebrew and seventh in Hebrew sound very much alike. There's almost a play on words there in Genesis 2. That on the seventh day, God rested. In Hebrew, that would have sounded kind of poetic or something in a way. Just the way that those words sounded alike. But what about for us today? In Acts 20, in verse 7, Paul is on a missionary journey. He comes to Troas. He wants to meet with the church. He arrived early in the week, and he hung around until the first day of the week. And it says that on the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. In 1 Corinthians 10, the Lord's Supper is referred to as the breaking of bread. See if I can find the verse for you on that since you're turning and looking. Verse 16. The general expression breaking bread, which also just meant having a meal. Sometimes, hey, let's go over to my house and break bread. And sometimes you hear people say that today. What are you guys doing? Oh, we're breaking bread. I mean, granted, not many people say that. But you could say that. That's kind of a thing for a meal. But it also, in this case, was referring to the Lord's Supper, the breaking of bread. And this memorial was called the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20 and 21. Now, people often read from 1 Corinthians 11 whenever they're doing the Lord's Supper, but they usually start a little farther down in the text than the part where he said, when you come together, what you're doing is not the Lord's Supper. You're doing something else. You're just having a gluttonous feast, and you're not waiting on each other. There's just no manners, and there's nothing spiritual about it. But he called it the Lord's Supper. That's an interesting word. The word for Lord is kurios in Greek. And the possessive form of the word kurios is only found 2 places in the New Testament. This is one. The possessive form would be that which belongs to the Lord. The Lord's Supper. This is the supper that belongs to the Lord. And the word kurios in the possessive form happens again in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 10, where John said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. And then he received the great revelation for the church in these latter days. A great revelation. But it was on the Lord's day, the day that belongs to the Lord. Well, what was the day that belonged to the Lord? What day was exceedingly special to the Lord that it would be called His day and He would have His supper on it? In John chapter 1, I think I'm going to turn to that too. And we'll read a little bit of this. No, John chapter 20, verse 1. John chapter 20, verse 1. It says, Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. I mean, it would have been pretty easy for John to not mention. What difference does it make? You know, what difference does it make? After 3 days, he could have said, after 3 days, she comes to this tomb. But he mentions specifically, it's the first day of the week. The Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. The first day of the week is the next day after the Sabbath. And Jesus was resurrected on that day. And you look down at verse 19. It says, Therefore it was evening on that day. What day? The first day of the week. It was now evening on the first day of the week, and when the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, Peace be with you. So Jesus was resurrected from the dead on the first day of the week. Is Jesus' resurrection very important to you? To Christians? To anybody in the New Covenant age? Is that an important day, the first day of the week when He was raised? And He came and met with His disciples. The first time He met with them, they're in there, and all of a sudden He comes and He meets with them on the first day of the week. And you go, well, okay, why wouldn't He? That's the day He's raised. Why wouldn't He come see them on that day? But then in verse 26, this version, the New American Standard Version, says, And after 8 days, again His disciples were inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and He stood in their midst and said, Peace be with you. So the second time that Jesus came and met with His disciples was, as this version says, after 8 days. We've got an idiom here that would have meant something to the people of that time, which is lost on us. To say after 8 days we would think, let's see. Okay, so it had been 8 days. So the first day of the week, around to the 7th day of the week, that's 7th. And then the next day would have been 8th. And then after the 8th would have been Monday. But not one single commentator says that this was Monday. They say it was, as probably some of your translations say, a week later or 7 days later. But for them to say after 8 days, sometimes they would say things like, and after 3 days, so-and-so happened. And yet you look at the text, and it was 3 days. It was 3 days is when it happened. And the same thing is happening here. I even looked at the commentators that were linguistic commentators. That's all they do is just look at the words and say, well, this might mean something that needs to be explained. And they all said this. This was 1 week later. It was 7 days, and then the 8th day would have been the first day of the week again. Jesus came back on the first day of the week and met with them. He set a precedent that He's going to meet with His disciples on the first day of the week. And we've been doing this for 2,000 years. And the early church did it in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7. On the first day of the week, the disciples came together. Paul knew they'd be coming together. He wanted to meet with them. He waited till the first day of the week. The first day of the week, and then he went and he met with them. And that was the precedent in what happened. What happened after that? This is just a little historical stuff here. I have it on this paper. In AD 155, okay, so the last book of the New Testament was written in about AD 100. 55 years later, Justin Martyr, one of the early church fathers, indicated that Christians met on Sunday, and that was in Apology 1, chapter 67. And a little earlier than that, in the first half of the 2nd century, earlier than 155, probably around 120 or so, there was a little book written called the Didache, D-I-D-A-C-H-E, Didache. And it was a little handbook written by first century Christians on kind of how to get a congregation started in a new place or something like that. It was a tract kind of or something, but it helps you see what they were thinking at that time. And it said that Christians met for the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day. That's Didache, section 14, verse 1. The Christians met for the Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day. And then even earlier than that, in AD 107, Ignatius, one of the elders in one of the congregations, he spoke no longer of observing Sabbaths, but observing the Lord's Day. He said, quote, on which our life also arose with him. So we see Jesus establishing a precedent. He was raised on the first day of the week. He met with his disciples and he set a precedent for meeting with them on the first day of the week. They continue to meet on the first day of the week. The church in the 2nd century was meeting on the first day of the week. And in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1, I'll just read that one too. Paul's talking about this collection he's going to make. And he said, concerning this collection for the saints, I directed the churches of Galatia, so do you also. On the first day of every week, let each one of you put aside and save as he may prosper, that no collections be made when I come. Now, if you analyze that and think, well, why would he say put aside on the first day of the week? Well, he was talking about a collection, and he knew that they were going to meet on the first day of every week. They met on the first day of every week. What for? To break bread, to take the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper on the Lord's Day, the first day of every week. And as long as you're together, that would be a good time to collect this money and put it into wherever they put it, into your treasury, your savings account, whatever they had in Corinth at the time. But it was not their practice to do this occasionally or on a quarterly basis or anything else. They met on the first day of every week. They observed the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week, and that was the practice of the church for a really long time. And it is the practice of our church as well, to do the same thing that they did then. Okay, questions? Yeah, this would be a good time for questions.
Does this mean that collections are only to be made on the Lord's Day for the church?
The collection,
That part is confusing.
the collection was a specific commandment for a specific thing. He was raising money for one thing that was going to be happening. That was, he was on his way back to Judea. They'd had a famine. There were a lot of people that were impoverished. And so the churches that had not been affected by the famine were collecting money to send back for this benevolent cause. There really is no commandment to us about how to collect. We look at this and say, well, that seemed to have been a good idea to collect money for this thing that was going on. So why don't we just do that? Because we're going to meet on the first day of every week also, so we'll just go ahead and take a collection. Now mine, I'm on Social Security, and they don't pay me every week. The church used to. They either gave me a check in the olden days or just deposited it right in. Every week they did that. I miss those days. So now, I've got this push pay, and it takes out once a month. I figure out what I would give in, every week, and just multiply times 4, and that's what it takes out.
So it's okay to do that.
Oh, yeah.
I think it is okay to do that, yeah.
That's what I-
Because the commandment of the Lord was to meet on the first day of the week and to observe the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, to remember Him. That was important. But this thing about raising the money was a specific commandment for something that was happening just at that time. And we have adopted that because that's a good idea.
Yeah, the way I read it is kind of Paul's just saying, since you're meeting anyways, I don't want you when I arrive to try and scramble to get all this money right away. So since you're meeting every week anyways, just set a little bit aside every week when you meet normally. And then when I'm there, you have it to give to me to take to Jerusalem.
I've been wondering who's going to take my place and teach this class today. He has the right answer every time. John always has the right answer.
I'm taking credit for that.
You should.
Yes, I think that is exactly right. That's the way I would put it too. Okay, so what have we learned? Okay, let's kind of stop and inventory. God selected the Hebrew people to bring the promised Savior into the world. That was the purpose for the nation of Israel. That was their purpose. They fulfilled their purpose. He kept them collected under the law. The law was the tutor to hold them together until the Messiah came. The Messiah was coming into the world. He had to come somewhere. He had to be anticipated by somebody. He had to be recognized by somebody. And God made sure there was somebody to recognize Him when He came. And they did that. They served their purpose. God gave the Jews and only the Jews the Mosaic Law. So if I had my pointer, I would point at the little Mount Sinai over there, and that's where the law was given to them. It wasn't given to any other nation. It was their law for their nation. And this law was like a tutor that brought them through the ages until the right time when the Messiah would come. The Messiah came to them to the right people at the right time. And when Jesus died, the Mosaic Law was nailed to the cross and a new covenant began. So that's what we've said so far. You would be probably amazed how many people that are in the world, that are in churches, and that are saying, well, we're Christians, would have not one single clue about this because it's never talked about it. And yet it's a huge part. It's one of the biggest things that you have to learn. If you want to get that book and understand what that book is, you've got to understand this. Paul said we need to rightly divide the word of truth and know what the divisions of the Bible are and what was for what purpose. So that's what we have looked at thus far. Now, we're now in the Christian dispensation. Okay? So we're around to the last circle now, the circle that's incomplete because it's not finished. The other two were completed and their time was up. And now we're in a new covenant. And that is an ongoing covenant which will continue until Christ returns. So we need to realize who we are and where we are. Let's look in Matthew 16. Kind of keeping an eye on the clock here. We got some time, and I hate to not use the time that we have. Yes.
Page 15 what about the thief on the cross? Do you have a handout, or is that discussion going to be later, or tabled, or?
That's something I thought was a great idea to put on there about 4 years ago, and I never bring it up because we probably spend the whole class period talking about that, and we kind of under time constraints. But I'll give it up since you brought it up. A lot of people today, they say, well, I want to be saved like the thief on the cross. How was he saved? Well, he was just, there nailed to the cross with Jesus. And one of the thieves just said, I don't believe in you. And the other guy said, man, you shouldn't talk to him this way. Don't you know who he is? And he said, what did he say? Did you look that up, Michelle?
The other answer is we read him saying, do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. And turning to Jesus, he said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom.
There you go. So he just said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said, today you will be with me in paradise. And so we say, well, wait, we should be saved that same way. We should be able to just say, Lord, just remember me one of these days when you return. And you say, well, okay, but what covenant was in force at that time? The law of Moses was in force. Jesus was still under the law, so was this man. This man was a Jew. He was already in a covenant relationship with God. He was a sinner, but he is now a repentant sinner. What he needed was a sacrifice for his sins. It would be a little bit hard to come down from the cross, go get a lamb, and take it to the temple, but the sacrifice for his sin was right there. And Jesus said, yeah, I forgive you. Jesus has the power to do that. And I don't ever want to try to legislate what Jesus can and can't do. He can do whatever he wants. But I tell you this, if you realize the circumstances, the covenant circumstances, it's different today because people that are sinners in the world today are not in a covenant relationship with God at all. They are aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, from the blessings of Christ. They are aliens and they need to come into a covenant relationship. And that covenant relationship comes whenever we hear about Christ, we believe, we confess, we repent of our sins when we're baptized into Christ. Now, if there are exceptions to that, it's not my place to know what they are or to teach those things. The Lord can do whatever He has under His, He even has a system set up Himself, and whether He would break that or not, I'm not going to say. But I will say this. My place is to teach what the new covenant rule is for how to become a covenant citizen of God. So I'm going to teach that. So the thief on the cross really is a moot point because it was a different covenant, a different circumstance altogether. We are in a circumstance now where we need to see what the new covenant commandments are and to try to teach and observe those things. So way to go. But if you don't understand the covenants, then you don't understand how that you can look at this thing about the thief on the cross. It does make a difference right up until the time Jesus died. Now, when He died, then that covenant was nailed to the cross. But if you go to the book of Acts, you see that it was quite some time before they ever started kind of figuring out how to make those transitions. They were pretty ingrained in the law, and I think God was patient with them for a period of time. But boy, it's been a long time since then now, and we're not in the same circumstance. So we need to know what covenant that we're under and to obey those terms. Okay, good one, good question there. Oh yeah, okay, so Matthew 16 and verse 18, Jesus has said, Who do you think I am? Peter says in verse 16, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he said, I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you will bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So Jesus is talking here about the church, and he foretells that it's coming. He doesn't say, I am now building my church. He said, I will build my church. He was looking to the future for when this was going to happen. So Peter had said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That faith and that confession are the foundation of the church. The identity of Jesus, that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. His identity is the firm foundation stone upon which the church is built. Not Peter. It's not built on Peter. He's just a guy. He's just a man. He had a lot to do with teaching people on the first day when the church came into existence, but he was not strong enough to hold or bear the weight of Christ's church. The church is built on the identity that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And that's what Peter said about him. And Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades, or death, even death will not overcome this. My death will not keep this from happening. Death will not keep you from inheriting the eternal kingdom. What I'm going to build is stronger than death. Chapter 18, verses 15 to 18. Jesus is giving some advice about how things would be happening within his church one day. He said, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. If he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax gatherer. So he's talking about someone that sins, and you go to them and what procedure to go through. But then he says you take it before the church. If you were to look at all the books of the Bible, let's look at all the Old Testament books. All 62 of them, isn't it? How many are there? Oh, yeah, okay. 39 books in the Old Testament. If you look at all of them, the word church is not found anywhere. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these 2 places are the only 2 places that the word church is found. And Jesus is foretelling the coming of his church and some things about it. But from Acts chapter 5 and verse 11 through Revelation 3 verse 14, the word church is found 79 times. It is in the book of Acts, and then Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, all the way through. That's where you learn about the church. Things regarding the church and what the church is supposed to be like is told in those books. That's where you find the story. Okay, we got just a second. Acts chapter... No, we don't. No. I know me, and I can't do it. So that's a good place to start next time. We'll talk about the beginning of the church and how we know what the beginning was, exactly when it started. So we'll look at that next time. All right, everybody. I hope we have a wonderful worship today and a celebration for our graduates and everything. And let's be dismissed.